Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to feed a couple of my European nightcrawler worm bins. One of them is already here on the bench. What I'm going to feed them is some food that my mom stopped by with once while I was actually down here filming, and I can hear somebody walking across the floor up on the up in the house because I'm down here in my basement. My wormery is down here in my basement. And when I went upstairs and saw that it was my mom, she was like, "Oh, I threw some stuff in your freezer for the worms." And it was stuff that I never even really looked at. It was just in a bag, and then some of it was in smaller bags, like all these little tops of strawberries and these little bits of potato peel. And then there was some other stuff like this head of broccoli and some cabbage. And I really didn't know what this stuff consisted of up until I just decided that, hey, you know what, today, just based on the weight of that bag, it seemed like the amount of food in that, based on its weight, was suitable for feeding a couple worm bins. So I kind of picked through it, and I realized that, hey, it looks like a pretty tasty assortment. They're going to love the broccoli, they're going to love the cabbage, strawberries. I think everything in there is stuff that they're going to really enjoy. Even the potato peels, since they were frozen, usually when I feed potato peels, they're frozen. And as that stuff thaws out, the worms really like to nibble that away pretty quickly usually. And I've had occasions where I didn't freeze the potato, and then the potato just starts growing, and it was just, I don't know. It sort of became a spectacle in one of my other couple of systems where the potato just kept on growing. Last time we checked in here, I think we bumped into a couple worms that were mating, and I saw all these worms out here on this paper hanging out, kind of making me wonder if we might see some more mating pairs, but I didn't see any here. So perhaps we'll get lucky when we pull into the next system to see what's going on in there. Although, I don't know, we're still not done removing all these top coverings. And this piece of coffee filter here, its job is just to show us where we last fed. The last feeding, I glanced at the video from last time really quick to see what happened here, and it seemed like they got a whole bunch of fresh leaves as bedding. And I don't know, after about 12 days now since that last check-in, my guess is we're probably going to bump into a good bit of that remaining as leftovers. And at the moment it just escapes me what exactly it was that we fed, but maybe we'll run into leftovers of that as well. So now I just sort of went deep dive, and I already found some leftovers, but that wasn't part of the last feeding. That was probably something that was fed quite some time ago. And here too I could feel some potato peel. Stuff that's really cut quite crisp and seems to snap. So perhaps here too we gave them potato peel that was not frozen first. And if you do that, it takes a while for the stuff to break down. The frozen potato peel, I have found that it just gets mushy and the worms are able to eat it almost immediately, and it doesn't have a tendency to start growing. So I think when it comes to feeding potato peels, that's definitely the way to go in terms of preparing them to be fed to a worm bin, is to get them in the freezer, let them freeze, and then that thawing process, I believe, is really what does the material in. Okay, I think it's starting to come back to me. This banana peel is ringing a bell. I believe banana peel was part of the feeding last time, and I believe it was in conjunction with something else. Something else that in my mind seemed like something that the worms would probably burn through quite quickly. And, you know, we're seeing leftovers because the peel itself is something that takes a while, and obviously the stem. But if there's any of the banana still stuck to the peel, or any chunk of banana in there, they'll eat that stuff pretty quickly, and they'll work it all down, but the more tough material will take them time. So I'm already seeing some of the leaves that were down here. Luckily there must have been enough moisture in here to really dampen all those leaves nicely and kind of soften them all up. Sometimes I go into the feeding zone of one of my systems, and when I use just a big bunch of fresh leaves, sometimes that stuff sits down there and stays, really dry, and worms aren't really going to get into it if they're feeling dryness. So here we had a couple chunks of pumpkin stem, and we've only excavated about half the feeding zone. So how about if we just go ahead and we just remove the rest of what's down here, and maybe we'll see some leftovers of whatever it is that was fed in addition to the banana peel, because right now it just seems to be eluding me. Perhaps in another moment or two the little hamster in the wheel will wake up and I'll be reminded of what it was that we gave them last check-in. Let's see here. These are sliced up bits of avocado pit. I just figured I would slice them off to try to, increase their surface area. And we've opened up a pretty good sized pit over here into which we could drop today's feeding. It was nice to see how those leaves had all kind of been really sort of adopted by the worms as not only their bedding, but it seems like they've been nibbling on it quite nicely too, because I didn't really see any pockets of uneaten dry leaves anywhere. And that would have really been the reason they would have ignored it if it was dry. So I guess the fact that it was nice and damp was probably the main reason they really enjoyed climbing into this stuff and hanging out in this stuff and even eating it while moving around through it. So I figured since we put in dry leaves last time, I would give them some nice prepared shredded paper and cardboard this go around. And I've got a couple replacement coffee filters. So I figured I would take the old coffee filter that was serving the function of feeding zone indicator and place it down into the feeding area as supplementary bedding, and then we'll go ahead and upgrade them with a nice replacement feeding zone indicator at the end. And then all these little leftover bits of banana peel that we bumped into along the way, and pumpkin stem, corn cob, whatever, we'll get all that stuff right back down into the feeding area. Little chunks of avocado pit. If you ever handled an avocado pit, it's like handling a little billiard ball, right? It's tough. It won't break no matter how hard you squeeze it, but it does seem like you put it into a worm bin, and in a fairly short period of time it softens up and becomes such that the worms are actually able to start taking advantage of it as a food source. So here I guess we've got the leaves of some cabbage as well as the stem. So I've got no real easy way to divide the stem up. So you know what, let's save the stem and maybe one leaf for the next bag, and then these leaves can be placed into here. I even thought that maybe if we could break this up into somewhat smaller little bits and spread it out, the worms can approach this stuff from many more angles as opposed to it just being in a big pile. Actually, there's another stem right here of something, probably more cabbage. So whatever, now they get a stem too. Both bins will get a stem, both bins will get a little bit of potato peel, both bins will get a little bit of strawberry peel, and at this point I feel like we've done a pretty good job divvying up the food into two fair portions. So before we cover up, I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell to serve as grit with their food, and I'm also going to kind of use the covering up of the feeding area as a reason to sort of excavate and till the outer edges of the bin. I was just thinking back to a few of my more recent worm bin check-ins, and it seemed like I had kind of departed from the process of checking the outer edges of my bins on a regular basis. It seemed like the last few worm bin feedings didn't include a tilling up of the outer edges. So I wanted to try to remind myself that I should probably get back to doing that. So we've got a pretty good sized hole here, as well as a bunch of material we excavated from the feeding zone, as well as a whole bunch of worms here too, it seems. I just figured we would sort of mix things around a bit and move some material from here to there and from there to here, and kind of give everything a fair shot at being worked on by the worms. Oh boy. And now we're kind of unearthing all the worms that were excavated out of the feeding zone earlier. I can't remember which bin it had an estimated number of worms right around the 1750 mark, and the other bin was only about 50 worms more, closer to the 1800 estimate. And I mean, this bin here was 99 days old last time we checked in on it. Today it's 111 days old at this point. So after all that time, the original estimate of how many worms lived in a worm bin has probably changed. I'm assuming that the number would have increased over time with the worms just mating and increasing their numbers over time, or at least that's what I hope for usually. So I'm not even sure exactly how many worms live in here, but as you can see, it's a pretty nicely populated system. And they say if you give them a lot of bedding to cruise around in and to occupy, then they'll go ahead and they'll keep increasing their numbers until such a point where they sense that they're approaching overpopulation, at which point they'll stop. But the worms are pretty prolific breeders. So it does seem like we've got a few little leftovers of unearthed food here, which I always feel like I want to submerge a little bit below the surface, but it's probably not the end of the world if we leave a little bit out on the surface. We've got pretty thorough coverings. Besides our nice feeding zone indicator here, we've got that top covering newspaper, which we'll put back now, and we've also got our plastic covering, which keeps the moisture that's in the bin in and doesn't allow it to escape. And luckily this is a bag that almost perfectly fits this size container, going almost perfectly around all the edges, leaving very little, if any, air gaps for ventilation and for drying. So I think whatever moisture is in here almost all stays. And then this little top here is really just to give them some shade, a little bit of privacy so the bright daylight doesn't go shining through this translucent material. On to the next bin. Let's get them out here and feed them next. Okay, so this system I believe was 75 days old last time, and now, like I mentioned earlier, 12 days later, it has reached the age of 87 days old. And my bins are, you know, whenever they're set up this way as sort of buddy bins and sister bins or whatever the case may be, I do attempt to run them very similar to each other. And it's usually during the check-in of the first of multiple bins that I tend to take a little bit more time just to size up how things are going, but it's usually on the second bin where I sort of begin getting that sense that I already kind of know what's to be expected, and then I just sort of breeze through the check-in a little bit more rapidly. So it's probably how we'll handle feeding this one too. We'll probably see leftover banana peels. We'll use the old feeding zone indicator as bedding and replace the feeding zone indicator with a nice new one. We'll see about airing up the material in the bin in general. So here, this is an example of what I had mentioned earlier, where sometimes the moisture doesn't really permeate into all the bedding that you added if it was added dry. And then it might just sit there unapproached by the worms, but it does seem like whatever we did in the other bin seemed to really help that stuff along considerably by being damp enough so that the worms felt really comfortable getting down into it, occupying it. Whereas in here, we I guess didn't have quite the same setup, despite my efforts to try to keep things pretty similar in these matched up sister bins. So I think some of what I'm bumping into here, this might just be paper and cardboard, but I think we're going to start finding objects that are similar in the two systems. I guess we'll pile up bedding type materials to one side. Any food scraps we find, we'll put them on the opposite side so that they could be returned to the feeding area. And I guess some of the similarities we're seeing already, like little bits of corn cob here, except these corn cobs were cut up into small pieces versus what we saw in the other bin. More leaves, which at the same time, while I'm excavating, I'm also just seeing about maybe breaking apart little clumps of stuff so that maybe it can just be blended in with some of the surrounding materials. This, I believe, is a piece of banana peel. This is just paper, maybe cardboard that had some sort of tape with reinforcing strands within the tape. Oh, here's some more banana peel, kind of what I was expecting. I was expecting to find a fairly intact piece of banana peel, very similar to what we saw in the other bin. And once again, no surprise, here's some more hunk of pumpkin stem. It seems like the worms sort of getting into this little crack have already separated this one hunk of the material from the rest of it. I usually try to leave stuff like that intact just so we can slowly observe how the worms work the stuff down without any help. And then other things, for whatever reason, I have this feeling like I want to try to help them break down. This, I think, is some vegetable material that was also placed into the bins raw. And it seemed like check-in after check-in after check-in over and over again, we would keep running into this stuff and never see any progress on it whatsoever. And if it is that stuff, it is nice to see that it's finally starting to show signs of breakdown, because we would pull that stuff out every time and it would show no signs of breakdown. So it's kind of nice when that point finally happens. Certain foods, they just take forever. And I guess these corn cobs are a good example of that. A lot of people feed corn cobs, and a lot of people already know that corn cob is just one of those things that's going to take quite a long time for the worms to break down. Yeah, you know, quite a significant difference in terms of how the leaves got handled by the worms in these two bins. A little bit surprising. And then here and there, we're just starting to bump into like larger chunks of, more of that reinforced tape, I believe, is what we're seeing here. Holding together pretty good on this hunk of cardboard. I just figured if it was possible, I would try to fragment it into somewhat smaller bits, but that reinforcing tape seems to be holding it together pretty good. Okay. Even though there's a lot of leftover bedding in here from the last check-in, I think just perhaps, if for no other reason, maybe just for the sake of consistency, I'm going to go ahead and do the same as we did in the other bin. Just grab about a handful of my prepared shredded paper, cardboard leaves mixture here, which also in itself has a little bit of dampness to it. And lay that down as the foundation for today's feeding. We'll return all these leftovers, as well as recycle this old feeding zone indicator to be supplementary bedding, and then we could pile in today's yummy foods. Let's do the same here and bust this up into little pieces. I grabbed my little pocket knife earlier when I bought this stuff down here originally, and I tried to break that head down the middle into two pieces, even though it was frozen. But before putting it in here, I didn't want to just drop it in as a huge mound. I thought it'd be nicer to try to get it in here as separate little pieces. And from what I remember, they really do enjoy the broccoli. They really do enjoy lettuce. Even if it's this thick stem, it doesn't seem to stick around as leftovers usually by the next check-in. Even frozen potato really does a great job. So I think we're ready to begin putting all this stuff back in here. Let's get all this large cardboard bits back down in here. Here's another chunk of corn cob. All right, I'm starting to get myself a little bit dirty here. And what did we do last time? Last time we took this opportunity to cover up with some of the material that made up this outer edge over here, sort of shuffling the deck, right? Getting some of the material that was down in the feeding area moved around, getting some of the stuff that was on the outskirts closer to where the feeding areas are going on. And I think in this case especially it'll do the system good just to sort of disperse a lot of this this bedding material that we unearthed out of the feeding area, to try to help it get a little bit more action by being spread out all over the place within the bin. There's the stem of a banana. Alright, let's start leveling things off here. I'd also like to just excavate a little bit and till up the material on the opposite edge. I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty sure we did that in the other bin as well. And that'll just end up ensuring that we don't have little pockets of material that's sort of just sitting there clumping up and getting no worm action, or possibly remaining in such a state that it's not getting sufficient airflow and possibly starting into a less desirable form of anaerobic or oxygen lacking decomposition, which when it happens tends to have a pretty stinky odor. That's one of the main reasons I do like to fluff up and aerate my systems on a pretty regular basis, to prevent that from happening anywhere. A lot of people will say, you know, geez, why don't you just plop in the food and cover back up and leave them be? And I guess the reason is that I'm also curious, like to see what's going on, but I also do believe that there's also benefit to aerating the system a little bit. So let's put our replacement feeding zone indicator right over where we applied today's nice yummy feast, and we can get things covered back up. Well, this piece of paper's coming along pretty nicely. If it continues deteriorating this way, we're going to probably end up using this as supplementary bedding down in the feeding area as well, and replacing it soon. But for now it seems to be holding up good enough to be reused. And I guess it was good that it was sitting here on top of this plastic covering up these little worms that got left behind, so that they wouldn't feel like they're getting thrust out into the bright lights and dry air. So if that had happened, they might have already tried squirming away and ended up someplace dangerous. So this way they're a little bit safer by being covered up. All right, everyone, I've got a couple things that I need to take care of getting cleaned up over here and put away, but that's all stuff I could do off the camera because it's boring. But you know what, before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching.